Today we're gonna make my cinnamon chocolate chip cake along with a brown sugar cinnamon cream cheese frosting. It's amazing. You're gonna love it. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss anything. And let's get started. Now this cinnamon chocolate chip recipe is my second favorite cake recipe to make. My first, of course, is my chocolate cake, and I have a link for that. You can click on right over here or in the description box. I'll have a link to that video as well. So cinnamon chocolate chip. If you're looking at the recipe and you're reading it, you're going, this sounds a little bit strange. The ratio seems a little bit off, but I promise it works. And I'm including the regular recipe for sea level as well as high altitude adjustments. So if you live very high altitudes like I do, you can still have a cake outcome that turns out amazing. Now the recipe is down below in the description box. Click the show more button, or of course you can click over to my website, ashleemarie.com, and the recipe is there as well. So let's get started with this cake recipe. First off, a lot of flour, a lot of brown sugar, and finally some cinnamon. Now, obviously I have a ginormous mixer, which works really well for these super big batches when I'm making big amounts of cake. If you do not want to make a huge cake, you're looking for something a little bit more standard size, this recipe cuts really nicely down 3/4 or half or 1/4. It divides by 4 really nicely. Now we're gonna add cold butter cut into pieces, and we're gonna mix that up. So basically this is not like any other cake recipe. Instead of nice softened butter, this butter is cold. Instead of beating the butter all the way in and incorporating the butter and sugar and creaming it, it's more like a pastry where we're cutting the butter in with the beaters, and it's like pea-sized chunks, and just wait till you see what comes next. Now we're gonna add the eggs one at a time and beating in between. Did you know the difference between baking soda and baking powder is that baking powder is baking soda with cream of tartar in it. And the reason for that is the cream of tartar helps balance out the bitterness of the baking soda, turning it into a baking powder that you can work with in baked goods without having to add any extra acidity. If a recipe calls for baking powder or baking soda, make sure that you use the right ones because they're balanced that way for a reason. Now, most cakes call for baking powder because most cakes don't have extra acidity in them. This cake actually calls for baking soda, and we're mixing it in with some sour cream. We're gonna mix these together and it's gonna have this awesome chemical reaction, and it's really fun to watch. And then we're gonna let it sit for about 2 minutes to let it start its reaction. Now you wanna make sure that you're using a bowl much bigger than the sour cream because this is gonna grow. Look how much it's grown, it's huge. And now we're gonna add it into the mixer along with some milk and mix. Very last ingredients, the mini chocolate chips. And the batter's done. It's time to prepare our pans. But before we do that, just a really quick note. You'll notice this is a really thick batter, and it's a massive amount of batter, and it's not a massive amount of baking soda. This is gonna be a more dense cake, like I mentioned earlier. It's not gonna rise quite as much as maybe a more traditional cake that you're thinking of. I prepared my pan by spraying the sides. I'm gonna put a parchment paper circle on the bottom. Now, typically I use this massive amount of batter to do a 3-layer 8 or 9-inch cake. And it works beautifully, but I wanted to go for a little bit more height. So today I'm switching it up. I'm going with some 7-inch pans, and I'm gonna use 4 instead of my typical 3. Evenly divide the batter among whatever pans you've chosen to use. Then spread it as smooth as you can. And then we're gonna bake them. Now to bake as flat as possible, I not only adjust for my altitude, but I also use these bake even strips. Now this bakes a little bit lower and longer. It bakes at 325 for about an hour. Now you need to make sure that you're making adjustments in temperature and length of time for high altitude. The notes are down below as well. Now with this cake, it's a little bit harder to tell when it's done because if you stick a cake tester in it and pull it out, you're actually gonna come out with a lot of melted chocolate from all of those mini chocolate chips. Once there's no longer a jiggle, you wanna just touch very lightly the top of the cake. And if it stays indented, it's still a little bit raw, needs to cook a little bit longer. If it bounces back, it's done. The other way you can tell is it'll start pulling away from the sides a little bit. You will notice it's also a lot darker than you would expect a cake to get. I promise it's not burnt. The outer edges just get really dark on this one, but that's fine because we're gonna level this. You'll also notice the outside gets a lot harder than a lot of other cakes, but the inside is so soft and delicious. For cake leveling, use a really sharp serrated knife and a good turntable. So you don't need to press too hard. We just want to make a little cut, and when you get all the way around, your cut lines should meet up, and if they do, then you know you have a nice even level, and you can actually then start putting a little bit of pressure in the knife. Just let the turntable really do the work for you. But look at the inside, how soft and moist that is. Oh, this is still warm with those chocolate chips. Now for some cakes, I only level the top, but for this one, I level the bottom as well. Now, because the bottom is perfectly flat and doesn't have any dips in it like the top might have, you can actually go with a really shallow cut. See, super thin. Now you can frost this cake with pretty much any frosting. Chocolate ganache buttercream, chocolate buttercream, cream cheese frosting, chocolate cream cheese frosting. Really the possibilities are endless. A lot of flavors go with this cake really well. Today I'm gonna make my brown sugar buttercream. Now brown sugar is pretty granular compared to powdered sugar that you typically use in frostings and icings and stuff like that. So what we need to do is get these grains smaller. So one option is to run it through your food processor and turn it into brown powdered sugar. But that takes a really strong food processor and can take a long time, and it's hard to do in small batches. You got to do like a medium-sized batch for that to work really well. The other option is you can dissolve the sugar by melting it in some way. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take some butter and the brown sugar, and then we're going to microwave and melt it. Now you don't want to boil it for too long, whether you're using the microwave or the stovetop, because then we'll start to turn into butterscotch syrup. And we don't want it to go even further and turn into toffee, of course. So you want it to stay nice and liquidy, not get too hot, but mostly melted. This is still just a little bit grainy, but it's not too bad. Now we want to set it aside and let it cool completely. I'll actually usually do this while the cakes are cooking so that it can cool completely to room temperature before we start making our frosting, because what you don't want to do is add warm butter and sugar to a frosting that's not like a meringue or something like that. This will just melt the frosting and you'll be left with a mushy mess. Now that it's cooled down, it's nice and thick and we're ready to move on with our frosting. First thing we're gonna do is add cream cheese. This is gonna add a lovely flavor and creaminess to this frosting. Now we're gonna add the brown sugar mixture, and then add your vanilla and beat it. Now that that's done beating and it's nice and creamy, we're gonna add our powdered sugar. Keep adding powdered sugar little by little until you're happy with the consistency, and then we're gonna add some cinnamon and beat. And look how great that final texture looks. Now comes the fun part. We're going to frost the cake. And the final layer. And then frost the sides. Once you have a nice thick layer of frosting on your cake, you can either leave it rough or you can use any straight edge tool like this to smooth it out. Now our cake's frosted and it's time to decorate it. This is where the fun really begins. This is where you can do anything that you want. Sometimes I'll just rough frost it and leave it just like that. Today we're gonna go a little bit fancier just for fun. So I have a mixture of mini chocolate chips as well as mini cinnamon chips, which are awesome and they're totally cute. And we're gonna put it on the side of the cake. And now we're gonna add a drip all around the top of the cake. So this is a chocolate ganache, which is 1 part chocolates and 1 part cream for a drip ratio. If you're making a frosting, it's a little bit different. Add more ganache to the top, and then we're gonna smooth it out. Now I'm gonna take those cinnamon chips and mini chocolate chips and put them around the top edge. Easy peasy, decorating is done. Now let's slice inside and see the cake. So you can see the denseness of this cake. My kids call it the cookie cake, although I've already made a cookie cake out of actual cookies. That's also on my site. You can check that out here. This one's definitely more cake-like than cookie, but it does have that wonderful flavor. And now the best part, get to try it. I love this cake. It's dense, but it's still moist and it's full of flavor. It tastes amazing with a ton of different frostings, so you don't have to stick with this one if you have something else that you really love. In the comments, I'd love to hear if you try this cake, what you think. Also, if you have another suggestion for me of a recipe or cake that you'd like to see here on the channel, as always, I hope you enjoyed this and thanks so much for watching.